My guest today is Professor Mike Wiest, who is Associate Professor of Neuroscience at Wellesley College. He researches the physical basis of consciousness. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Gill.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Mike, I know very little about these subjects, but I'm very, very interested in them. So you sent me a couple of articles, papers. So I want to start with the article that you sent me. How plausible is Penrose and Hameroff's org or theory of consciousness? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So you say here, I'm one of the few neuroscientists or physicists who think it is actually plausible and even promising. So below, I briefly explain more generally why I think quantum approach is needed. And towards the end, I consider how the Hameroff and Penrose theory could work in the brain. So this is Roger Penrose you're talking about?
That's right.
Okay. So again, no, I know nothing about cognitive science or astrophysics or high energy physics. A lot of, Roger Penrose won the Nobel Prize recently. My impression of Roger's theories that they're ideas. We don't have a lot of proof for them. So is this in the same vein or something different?
Well, okay. So first, you asked how people say it. People say OR for that abbreviation, which is an
Or
abbreviation. It's an
okay.
abbreviation for orchestrated objective reduction.
Oh,
And
I
so
see. Okay.
we
Yeah.
can talk about what that means, but objective reduction is referring to a solution to the so-called measurement problem in quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Okay, but so in terms of talking about how plausible is that OR theory, or why do we need a quantum approach? For a long time, it was mostly theoretical arguments supporting that approach, and I'll tell you some of those. But more recently, we've got experimental evidence that seems to support the idea. And I said there's sort of levels of this. So if we take the whole orchestrated objective reduction theory, it goes to a place that most people find hard to believe could really be relevant to what's going on in the brain, namely quantum gravity.
Yeah.
But we can take it one step at a time and start with why we would think quantum physics would be relevant at all, and then go to Penrose's arguments, which are rather theoretical, and yeah, they're theoretical. And so, but there are experimental predictions from his idea, especially his idea combined with Hameroff's idea.
Yeah.
And Hameroff is the one who had the idea about what could be doing the quantum stuff in the brain, what it might actually be in the brain that is doing something quantum. Okay.
Yeah. So sorry.
Or I can start anywhere you want, on more experimental side or more theoretical motivation. But I think maybe it makes sense to start with why quantum in the first place before we go to those higher level things. Like
yeah. So before we get the details, Mike, I just want to. So our audience has a sort of an eclectic mix: graduate students, academics. Some of them don't have a science background, economics, so on, social sciences. So consciousness is a loaded term. So do we have a definition for it?
We have ways of pointing at the phenomenon that we're trying to talk about. And so this question of definition comes up when you start talking about consciousness. And some people will take the attitude that, well, you don't have a rigorous definition, therefore you literally don't know what you're talking about, and this is not science, and we're wasting our time. But I think that's not appropriate, because if we think about, for example, the concept of electric charge, there was a time where we didn't have a rigorous mathematical definition of what charge meant in our sophisticated Maxwell's theory. We just had to say there's some substances that are pushing on each other, and what is that? We'll start by calling it charge and try to figure out what it is.
Yeah.
It's a similar thing with consciousness. So I'm saying it's not reasonable to ask for the final theory when you're just getting started trying to figure out the phenomenon, or the perfect rigorous definition when you're trying to get started with the phenomenon. But we do need to be clear about what we're trying to talk about. And so I would offer that to start, when I and most neuroscientists, when they use the word consciousness, we're not talking about self-consciousness or self-awareness, which is sort of a higher level thing. We're talking about the bottom level, where if you feel pain, that's an example of what we're talking about.
So as a human, I can understand that. But evolutionarily, do you think a single cell organism could have understood it?
You're asking if a single celled organism could have some
Could
form
have
of consciousness?
consciousness,
Yes, that's diving all the way to the deep end. But
yes.
so I'm going to say yes, it's possible, and I'll tell you how I think that's possible. Because in this quantum picture proposed by Hameroff and Penrose, they propose that it's the microtubules in our neurons that are the substrate of this quantum mechanical process.
Yeah.
That's the basis of our consciousness. And now, thinking more broadly about how consciousness might have evolved, most biological processes in higher level, what we call higher level organisms, tend to be built on machinery or processes from earlier, lower level organisms.
Sure, yeah.
And the microtubules that we have, everything alive has them, including plants and single-celled organisms. They use them to move. And single-celled organisms appear to also, this is not appreciated by that many people, but there are experiments showing that they can detect light and process the light information so as to orient themselves or to approach things, almost like they have vision, but they have no neurons. They only have microtubules. And one more thing to just make this, what can sound very implausible, to make it sound a little more plausible to you, is the same anesthetics that put us to sleep also stop single-celled organisms from wiggling around. The same chemicals. And also Venus flytraps and stuff. But plant processes are also sensitive to same anesthetic gases as us. And so one of the early people who studied anesthesia, Claude Bernard, proposed that as almost a definition of life. He has a nice quote, something like, "What is alive must sense and can be anesthetized. The rest is dead." So there we're sort of conflating life and consciousness a little bit, or maybe a lot, but I'm viewing it as that life has some degree of agency, like having goals, and some degree of integration and flexible behavior. And single-celled organisms, you can watch YouTube videos of them running around like little dogs and crabs and snakes and stuff. They don't look like bags of just chemicals diffusing back and forth. They look like little animals. That doesn't prove anything, but the anesthesia is something to note, I think, that it affects single-celled organisms.
Yes, it's really interesting. So self-awareness. So I haven't read this more recently, Mike. So I know that, so bacteria, for example, they could have a quality that appear to sort of understand each other, to have a common objective. So what do you think about that? Yeah.
Well, I certainly don't expect a paramecium or a bacteria to have thoughts like we do,
Yeah,
or emotions like we do, complicated perceptions like we do, but maybe they have some kind of simple proto consciousness, we might even be tempted to call it, instead
yeah,
of consciousness, that maybe involves some sensation of this is good or this is not good, um, and some distinguishing of things in the environment, but nothing on the level of what you didn't quite come out and say self-awareness, but certainly I wouldn't expect anything like self-awareness in a single-celled organism or even most multicellular organisms,
right.
but maybe some kind of sensation.
Yeah, so I don't know anything about this, Mike. So I just want to ask you. So it appears to be sort of an optimization thing. Let me just posit something, and you can challenge or negate that. So suppose consciousness is sort of a optimization thing. So I want to optimize my own system if I'm a human, for instance, and if I am sort of a smaller organisms, maybe there is a societal thing I'm trying to optimize. And so is this really, let me ask it differently. Um, is it expected to emerge from a systemic perspective that, so if you want to optimize a system, over time you'll get there, let's say. So is consciousness sort of an optimization function in some way?
Um, what I want to say in answer to that is a yes and a no. That is, consciousness may be performing a function of optimization, but I do not want to say that anything that optimizes is conscious.
Yeah,
Um, and when we talk about, I hope we can talk about some of the specific details, I guess, or experimental evidence. But when you talk about looking at it from the perspective of optimization, um, one way of understanding quantum dynamics is as an optimization. That is, if you've heard of the principle of least action,
hmm,
it's a way of formulating also classical physics, but then when we went to quantum physics, that seemed to be the best way to to formulate the theory that was consistent with special relativity, for example.
yeah,
And that views the dynamic of nature as minimizing the action, which is an optimization.
hmm,
And so if creatures have evolved a way to map their personal problems onto
hmm.
that natural optimization dynamic in an abstract general sense, that could be very powerful.
Yeah, so you are sort of a unique intersection of physics and neuroscience. Not many people have done that. Um, and so I want to go through this article here. So temperature objection. So my understanding of Google's um, a quantum computer and IBM's quantum computers, and you have to cool these things down to almost absolute zero.
Yeah,
Um, so how could the brain be in such a situation?
yeah. That is the immediate objection of most people who have thought about this. Um, when we try to do things like this, quantum computation technologically, it seems that we need extremely cold temperatures. So our brain seems way too hot for that. And neurons also, they're pretty small, but they seem too big for
Hmm.
quantum effects to most people.
Yeah.
So big things, and they're warm as well. That's supposed to be terrible for quantum effects. I'm going to give you some theoretical reason that that is not conclusive, but I guess I want to start by saying this year we got experimental evidence that at room temperature,
Hmm.
there are quantum effects in microtubules. So
Oh,
that
wow.
experiment was not yet in the brain, in a living brain, but it
Yeah.
was in vitro, and the effect got stronger as the microtubules were joined into larger structures.
Hmm.
And so, that right there knocks out, in my opinion, knocks out that temperature objection.
Hmm.
But we can understand theoretically also why we shouldn't have been so quick to dismiss it, which is that the point of view that says it's extremely hard or unlikely to have this delicate quantum state in a warm thing is based on equilibrium
Hmm.
thermodynamics, equilibrium physics. But
Yeah.
equilibrium means dead. So it
Hmm.
is inappropriate to model a living brain. It's potentially inappropriate to model a living brain. And there are explicit biophysical models that show how if energy is being pumped through a system, and the model specifically was a system of biological electric dipoles, which just
Yeah.
means, okay, so dipoles, almost everything in biology, all the proteins, lots of the proteins have little dipoles on them, and microtubules are made out of little dipoles.
Hmm.
And he showed, this was Froelich, Herbert Froelich, all the way back in the late 60s and 70s, that pumping metabolic energy through a system
Hmm.
can act to organize these dipoles into coherent vibrations that
Hmm.
are stable against thermal disruption. So that's
Yeah.
not all
So,
the way, yeah, that's not all the way to a quantum computer, but it shows
yeah.
that there is a way to get around the temperature problem. Now you can ask me, why haven't they done that to make a quantum computer yet? I don't know the answer to that yet, or I don't know the answer to that, but I think people are looking into pumping. You have, and probably in your office, an example of quantum coherence at room temperature, which is a laser pointer.
Oh, yeah.
And it works, it avoids the need for ultra cold temperatures by using a battery to pump some energy through the system and to pump those photons up to their excited state so they all rain down together
Hmm.
as coherent light. But that's an example of that pumping idea, that when energy is being pumped through a system, the system is not at thermal equilibrium,
Yeah.
just like the whole Earth, with the sun pumping energy into it, and then we radiate the energy out. You can also see that as why it's not so crazy that complex life would evolve,
Hmm.
because non-equilibrium thermodynamics is different from dead equilibrium thermodynamics.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. I clearly have a bias here, Mike. So, um, artificial intelligence, it's a little bit on a tangent. Um, so engineering, AI is fundamentally engineering, um, is quite different from biological systems. So this idea that we're going to get to artificial general intelligence through engineering, I argue it's a false idea, um, because I think it's a two different fields, right? Cognitive science is fundamentally different from computer science, and we have sort of borrowed terms and ideas from both fields, but they're not the same, right? What do you think about that?
It's true. So in biology, we got fields like computational neuroscience, or you said cognitive science. And then on the other side, we've got artificial intelligence, machine learning, the engineering side of that field of, I guess, artificial intelligence, or just intelligence.
Yes, yes.
So the biologists are interested in figuring out how the brain or an organism really does it. The engineers care about getting it to perform well.
Hmm.
And if they can do that by imitating biology, fine. If not, I think you don't really care, but you can tell me. But then when you get to the question of, is our large language model going to be conscious, then we are at the overlap And I do want to make sure we distinguish intelligence from consciousness. I don't think they're
Right,
synonymous.
right.
Um,
Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, so how do you distinguish the intelligence from consciousness?
I would say, to make it clear, I would say intelligence is purely a behavioral thing. It's whether
Hmm.
you can pass a particular test. It's always relative to some test, some problem to solve. Um,
So it's a measurable thing. It's a very
right,
measurable,
right. You know,
like IQ tests
on
and
the other
stuff.
hand, there's a certain arbitrary tune to it because it's always relative to some test, and that test is arbitrary, can be biased in various ways. So yeah, I believe there's really such a thing as intelligence, but it is more relative to a test or relative to what you can do practically, as opposed to intrinsically what it feels like to be doing these thoughts. And that's what I mean by consciousness. Consciousness
Yeah,
is not a matter of how you're behaving, it's what you're feeling and thinking.
yeah. This is so interesting, Mike. So can we measure consciousness? There's just like this IQ points that we give to intelligence. Is there a CIQ, consciousness IQ, that we could measure?
Um, Only in a descriptive or non-fundamental way right now. So
Hmm.
I saw you talk to Christoph Koch about that,
Yeah, yeah,
and various people have different ways of using EEG to know when someone is conscious or not, but we're not at the level where we can derive that from a fundamental theory, even the integrated information theory that Koch
hmm.
favors.
Yeah. So
Um,
we want to go there as well. So let me ask you this. So is consciousness
Sorry,
sort of a binary thing? Sorry. Yeah.
well, if
Go
I
ahead.
can add about
Yeah.
the artificial intelligence thing,
Yeah.
I want to relate it to the quantum issue because um, okay, you posed it more in terms of whether we're going to get to artificial general intelligence. And I guess I'm somewhat agnostic about that, except I noticed that for like 50 or 60 years, we've been 15 years away from
Yes. Yes.
getting there. And I can't help but think, if we're leaving something out, couldn't it be consciousness? I mean, we are not intelligent when we're unconscious. Maybe it's silly of us to think we can make a machine be smart in the same flexible way that we are without knowing what consciousness is.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of thinking about whether our machines are going to be conscious or whether they are now, what I would submit is that it's crystal clear that they cannot be conscious now, not because of what we see about how well they do playing chess or recognizing
Yeah.
faces, but because, in my opinion, the substrate has to be quantum mechanical, has to be an entangled quantum mechanical state. So let me, if I may, try to explain why I think that has to be,
Yeah.
not just I believe it because I've seen experiments that support it as well. But it's this: our conscious states, our experience, every one of our experiences is some combination of multiple features, shapes, colors, sounds, a whole visual field.
Hmm.
So it's made out of multiple features, but somehow I experience it as one whole thing
Hmm.
that happens to me. People refer to this as the unity of consciousness.
Hmm.
And so there's an issue. What in the brain could there be that can account for that unity? You
Hmm.
know, you might be looking at a red chair, and the shape of the chair is represented by neurons in one place. The color of the chair is represented by neurons in another place. Somehow
Yeah.
we feel it, we experience it as one thing, and that goes
Yeah.
for the whole visual field as well. That's called the binding problem.
Hmm.
And it is insoluble in classical physics
Hmm.
because I said our conscious states are wholes, WHOLE. They're irreducible wholes,
Hmm.
and there are no irreducible wholes in classical physics because everything that happens in a classical theory is reducible to little parts pushing on their neighbors.
Mm.
And you can convince yourself of that by remembering or noticing that every classical theory is written down as a differential equation with
Mhm.
dx's and dt's in it. That means infinitesimal neighbors and infinitesimal parts. And
Yeah.
so if you imagine some bigger thing in a classical theory, like a tornado, that thing is completely reducible to the local interactions. And so it's just for practical convenience, we have to give it a name.
Mhm.
But in the theory, there isn't an object that corresponds to that. There's just the dynamics of the wind.
Sure. Yeah.
In contrast, in quantum physics, a quantum state is an irreducible whole. Quantum
Mm.
physics is the dynamics of irreducible wholes that have multiple parts. And we had Nobel Prizes about proving that,
Mm.
you know, non-locality and entanglement.
Yeah.
In my mind, that may be the most profound thing we have ever discovered as a species, because before that, we could imagine everything was working like a clock,
Yes.
pushing mechanically on each other. Now we know things can talk to each other across the galaxy instantaneously. And I'm not saying anything about across the galaxy, but I'm saying that's how we bind the activity in our brain
Mm.
into one thing, one unified experience. And
Yeah.
furthermore, that can explain how our conscious states could have evolved, which is left as a giant
Mm.
coincidence in a classical theory.
So let me ask you this, Mike. So I haven't really thought through this. So suppose there's some sort of Wi-Fi system in the brain that any neuron can sort of dial into anytime and get information, all the Google pages or whatever, right? Analogous things. Um, and so are we sort of in the wrong track that, to think about the electrochemical interactions of small things um, around the neurons and in the brain? Perhaps there's something different from it in the brain. So what do we know about that?
So I think you're referring to this idea that maybe we're like a radio receiver and our thoughts aren't
Yeah.
generated in the brain, but they're from somewhere else and we just
No, it doesn't
see
have to be
them.
somewhere else. I mean, there could be some sort of a Wi-Fi transmitter in the brain. So basically, I'm saying I think we've been on this track of neurons getting electrochemical information to the next neurons, the synapses, and then go on like that. But it doesn't have to be like that, right? I mean, there could be some central thing that is transmitting information in the brain. Is that possible?
Are you imagining another neuron or something other than a neuron?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but
I'll tell you. Okay, I think
yeah,
I can try to address that.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
um, first, you refer to electrochemical events. Could there be more than that? And I'm saying yes. I mean, I've already said yes in the sense that I'm focusing now also on microtubules that are inside the neurons.
yeah.
And so one way of expressing this is like
So,
someone,
Mike, can you define the microtubule? So
sure,
just for my own understanding, so
sure.
so the neurons get information and they transmit information. I don't know the technical terms for the things that they do, but the microtubule. So what exactly is that?
Yes, thank you. We better talk about that a bit. So microtubules are, I mentioned earlier, are in everything. So they're not just in neurons. And
Yeah.
so that's one way people can immediately object to this and say, well, if it's microtubules, then why isn't my liver conscious? Because we got microtubules everywhere.
Right.
They are very different in neurons and they have different functions in different cells. But what are they? So they're one of the main components of what people call the cytoskeleton.
Hmm.
They are literally tubes, and they're made out of protein building blocks called tubulin protein.
Yeah.
And so they're made out of 13 strands, polymers arranged in a tube.
Hmm.
And you know, each of those tubulin is a little electric dipole, and they can have resonances and quantum optical effects. It appears down the center of the tube. And in neurons, they tend to point at synapses, like photon torpedoes, you might say, from Star Trek. So, you know, also they are intimately involved in cell division, cell mitosis. You can see beautiful videos of them orchestrating the dance, the ballet of the two cells, pulling the chromosomes apart. So, you know, traditionally they have been thought of as part of the skeleton of the cell, meaning rigid poles, like tent poles, that give it its shape. And they do that, but they also have other known functions, or, you know, functions acknowledged by regular people. And now also we're adding this quantum idea, but they also function like train tracks, and little protein munchkins run up and down the train tracks and bring packets of material to different places in the cell. So they're well known, well studied in biology. But in the 80s, the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff said, it looks like these guys are doing more than just being tent poles, and they could be processing information and coding stuff like DNA. And as I say, there's evidence that they're involved in the activities of single-celled organisms as well. And in terms of how I should probably address how they talk to the membrane. And tell me if you want to come back to the receiver idea, because I could say a bit more maybe about that. But for the microtubule idea, there is an issue. Okay, first we started at the level of the electrochemical events on the membrane of the neuron, and they release chemicals at the synapses to send the message to the next neuron. That's the classical way of understanding how they do computations. And we can't ignore them, even if we have some new idea about microtubules. We can't ignore them because we know they are the way we get sensory information in, and they are also the way we activate our muscles to behave, like waving my arm and also talking to you. So we know that even if there is this extra microtubule thing responsible for consciousness, if that's the case, it must be able to talk to those events, electrochemical events on the membrane.
More holistically.
Well, that's what it offers. Yes, that's what it offers that the action potentials can't do. It can make a holistic experience that can help you guide your behavior.
Yeah, so we want to come back to this, Mike. So I want to just, we will come back to IIT that we want to talk about, but I want to go into this experiment paper that you have, which I find very interesting. So volatile anesthetics are currently believed to cause unconsciousness by acting on one or more molecular targets, including neural ion channels, receptors, mitochondria, synaptic proteins, and cytoskeletal proteins. Anesthetic gases, including isoflurane, bind to cytoskeletal microtubules and dampen their quantum optical effects, potentially contributing to causing unconsciousness. So, yeah, I mean, studying unconsciousness is potentially a much better profitable path to understanding consciousness. And so what do we find in this experiment?
Yeah. So what we did is we found so it turns out that there are a bunch of well-known drugs that affect microtubules, and they are known because they're used for cancer, because cancer involves malfunction of the microtubules because it's pathological cell division.
In a chemotherapy?
That's right. That's right. They're called neoadjuvants, I think is what they call those kind of drugs that work, that stabilize microtubules to try and prevent that pathological cell division. So The old versions of those drugs did not get into the brain well, but more recently they have made versions that can get into the brain and potentially help people with brain cancers. But so we took advantage of one of those called epothiolone B, or EPO-B, and basically we compared how long it took our rats to fall asleep. I'm using sleep colloquially, to fall unconscious under isoflurane gas, one of these gases that has been used on people as well and makes us unconscious as well. We timed how long it takes them to fall unconscious and just compare those times when they've gotten an injection of just control vehicle as compared to when we give them this microtubule binding drug. And we found that they took significantly longer to fall asleep when they had the microtubule binding drug. So we interpreted that as the microtubule drug was getting in the way of the anesthetic and making it harder for the anesthetic to put them to sleep. And so that's how we infer that the anesthetic appears to be binding to microtubules in order to cause unconsciousness. Now, I should quickly add that that by itself, that supports that microtubules are a or the molecular target of that anesthetic, but that by itself is not evidence of this quantum idea that I'm arguing for.
Yeah, so I think you talked a little bit about, I can't quite remember, Mike. So tolerance to the anesthetic over time. So if you
oh yes, tolerance.
If you expose the rat to the anesthetic over and over again, we find something interesting there as well, right?
Yes, from the point of view of the experiment I was trying to do, it was more of a nuisance, but it did allow me to say something about how tolerance develops in the rats, but I was more interested. It was, that was available to us to make a comment about that, but we were primarily looking at tolerance in order to say it wasn't tolerance that was responsible for them taking longer to fall asleep. But yeah, we found some tolerance effects that lasted for over a month, and that might contribute to the literature about how people have post-operative cognitive dysfunction and so on.
Yeah. So what's your major finding from this study, the rat study?
I'd say the major finding is our evidence that the anesthetic gas binds to microtubules to cause unconsciousness.
Binds to microtubules. So so you're hypothesizing or positing that consciousness sort of originate at the microtubule. Do I get you right?
That's right. Yeah, so the idea is the microtubules get into a collective state, a collective quantum state, and that is entangled across multiple neurons, not just in one neuron. And that collective state is, because it's quantum, it is unified. And that's how we can understand that if this neuron is representing red and this neuron's representing the shape of the chair, it's the unified microtubule state that explains how we can experience that as one thing, even though they're in different places.
So can we measure some sort of a scale effect? What I'm asking is, do you need so many microtubules or so many neurons before consciousness emerge? I mean, that should tell us, there's sort of a change, sort of a phase change in biological systems that gets to some level of complexity. Do we know that?
Okay, well, so far I've argued that we need to go to a quantum description because of the unity of consciousness.
Yeah.
But we started with ORC-OR, the Hameroff-Penrose theory, orchestrated objective reduction, and they go one or two steps beyond that. And so I think it's appropriate now to bring that up, because in their theory, consciousness is not just associated with any entangled state, but rather it's associated with when the wave function goes from a superposition of multiple possibilities and collapses into one definite possibility.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you asked about how many microtubules do you need. Basically, the number of microtubules that are unified in the collective state predicts or determines how quickly it will collapse from a superposition into a definite state.
Okay. So I don't know much about this, Mike. So I know the Copenhagen uh, wave thing.
Yeah.
I always felt that it's a little bit not very understandable. But are you suggesting that there is a scale effect, microtubule scale effect, that actually makes the wave function collapse?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
but it's not just in microtubules.
Okay.
So this is a more general idea from Penrose and other people. There's a string theorist who has a similar idea. It's an idea for solving the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. So you referred to the Copenhagen interpretation. I'll sketch that quickly so we can talk a bit about the
Yeah.
measurement problem. So in quantum mechanics, we have a evolution equation like we have in classical physics, which is a differential equation that says if you start with your state at this time, here's d psi dt, tells you how it's going to change over time. That's the Schrodinger equation in non-relativistic quantum mechanics. But that's not the whole quantum theory. The other part is measurements. And that postulate or that part of quantum mechanics says when you make a measurement, and it doesn't tell you what a measurement is, but when you make a measurement, the wave function tells you you square the wave function to find the probability of the different outcomes. So
Or you have the alternative world idea. Yeah. Alternative.
Okay. So that is very popular. And I'm going to tell you frankly that I think it is incoherent, and it's an embarrassment that so many smart people are spending so much time talking about it. It's not that I'm afraid of the idea of many universes. I'm willing to consider wild ideas. It's that it pretends to solve the measurement problem, but it does not solve the measurement problem.
Yes.
And so there's different ways. So the motivation is they like the Schrodinger equation. They don't want to do the measurements because they're ugly and they are confusing. So we just say we only do the Schrodinger equation. If you are pure about that, nothing will ever happen. It will make no predictions. Or alternatively, you could say it predicts that you'll see superpositions of dead and alive cats and all that stuff. And we don't see any of that. So if you go that route, it doesn't work. But if you instead say branching happens whenever a measurement would have happened, then you have exactly the same problem. You've just renamed it as the branching problem.
Yeah.
So that's my point of view on that. I'm afraid I'll offend some people, but that's how I feel about
No,
it.
I agree with you completely, Mike. I mean, I don't know anything about it, but that makes a lot more sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, so then we're sort of left with Copenhagen interpretation, which is leaving unanswered questions and saying we don't want to think about it. And we have sort of two other options. One is known as Bohmian mechanics or pilot wave.
Yeah.
And the other is objective reduction, saying these measurements are really something that happens in nature. And we just
So that's Penrose? The objective reduction thing is Penrose?
Yes.
Okay.
There are other people who have other theories of objective reduction, but he has one that's based on gravity, where it says if you go above a certain amount of mass in a superposition, then it becomes unstable and it will collapse by a quantum gravity mechanism. And so that's how it relates to the number of microtubules, because that just determines how much mass is in the superposition. And that's what decides how quickly it collapses. And that's what makes it consistent with our everyday experience, because large objects have a lot of mass, and so they'll collapse quickly.
Yeah. Yes, so how beautiful would it be, Mike, if you can come up with an idea that says there's a scale at which consciousness emerges, and it requires, these things for it to happen. That will tell us where consciousness actually happened or happens. Um, I think it's quite difficult, I would imagine, but it
No, they're
seems to
saying
me
it.
that, yeah,
Their theory
yeah,
is trying to predict or say that. It says, at least in its simplest form, it says whenever there is a quantum wave function collapse, that is a
yeah,
moment of experience. And so that
yeah,
in itself is objective reduction. The orchestrated part is that, the electrons in the table or whatever are going to be collapsing very quickly
mm,
into classical states and having tiny little meaningless experiences, whereas our brain has orchestrated a larger scale event, a
mm,
collapse event that embodies all this information and stuff that we think about. So that's
yeah,
the orchestrated part of orchestrated objective reduction.
mm,
So in terms of where is the consciousness happening, it's saying wherever wave functions are collapsing, there are tiny little proto-conscious events, but
yeah,
in our brain, they've been orchestrated to be big
yeah, yeah.
conscious events.
Yeah, I mean, your position in between high energy physics and neuroscience is really amazing. I mean, these fields are very different, but neither have had very robust answers to many of the things. But the question is if we can combine them, perhaps we can find better ideas. So I want to go into one of your other papers. So mixing integrated information theory, IIT, with quantum theory is futile, you say here. Um, you say the physical basis of consciousness in the brain is a central mystery of neuroscience and our own existence. Classical neuroscientific theories of consciousness have almost exclusively been descriptive theories, which merely summarize neural correlate of consciousness rather than attempts at a fundamental predictive and explanatory model. The most notable exception is Giulio Tonini's Integrated Information Theory, IIT, which boldly and unambiguously aims to be a fundamental theory of consciousness, capable of predicting the degree of consciousness manifested by an arbitrary physical system, as measured by the quantity phi defined theory. So this is actually quite topical. We have a lot of people in Silicon Valley running around saying we found a computer that is conscious. Um, we haven't got any data for it yet, but so talk a little bit about the IIT, the integrated information theory.
Sure. So, yeah, as you just quoted there, classical neuroscientific theories have tended to be kind of lists of you're conscious when this part is active and this kind of oscillation and synchronization and stuff like that, but we don't really know why. Or we can make metaphors like an ignition or a avalanche, or we've got all these metaphors, but that's not a fundamental theory. So yeah, Tononi I admire because he's not messing around anymore. He's trying to say what it really is. Um, and that's integrated information theory. And furthermore, what I admire about the theory is that it attempts to take the unity of consciousness that I was talking about before seriously.
Hmm.
Because you'll sometimes get philosophers, or it's much less common now. But in the 80s, you had Patricia Churchland, a well-known philosopher,
Oh
kind
yeah,
of
Pritesh has been
dismissing.
on the
Oh
on
yeah.
the podcast as well. Yeah.
So I don't know how she feels about it now, but in her book Neurophilosophy, she referred to the putative unity of consciousness, like she didn't
Hmm.
really believe it. I think it's
So
more or less
so let me
accepted.
ask you, Mike. So what do you mean by unity is sort of the whole brain thing, or
No, not
no?
necessarily
Okay.
the whole brain.
Okay.
Just whatever you're thinking of right now is, and so it doesn't even include all the active neurons.
Hmm.
You've got lots of neurons that are purely unconscious activity, and then some subset of the ones in cortex seem to
Yeah.
be the substrate of consciousness, but those are constantly changing according to what you're thinking.
Hmm. Okay.
And so it's those ones that it's that subset that I'm thinking of when I think of the substrate of consciousness at any given moment,
Huh. Okay.
not the whole brain.
So, so if I understand this correctly, Mike, are you saying consciousness is sort of a specialized subset of the brain?
I'm saying consciousness is a property of a
Yeah.
subset of active neurons, or more specifically, of the microtubules in a subset of active neurons.
So it's a subset, meaning at some point in the future, we can go into the brain and say, this is where the consciousness resides.
We can pretty much do that now. We just don't know. I mean, we can point at the neurons that correspond to thinking of your grandma or Jennifer Aniston and stuff like that. It's
Yeah.
quite amazing. I mean, we can only do a few at a time when there's a millions doing it, but we can pretty much say what specific neurons are contributing to your thoughts already.
Hmm.
It's just we don't know how that could possibly be. That
Yeah, but
somehow matter
thoughts
turned
are,
into spirit in there.
yeah, yeah. So let me ask you this. I don't know anything about this. So thoughts are computational, meaning, I can factor things, I can write algorithms to machine learning algorithms or whatever. Um, those are thoughts, but consciousness, well, this is my bias, um, seems to be something much more holistic than thoughts, aren't they?
You could say that. I think consciousness sort of is bigger, or is more than just the thoughts or the things we can put into words.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. But yeah, so you were saying they're still just computations. Maybe we could think of thoughts as computations. Um, yes, our thoughts have an aspect of computation, and I can think about what's 2 + 2 and figure it out and give you an answer if you need to know.
Yeah.
But that extra thing that I'm interested in is the feeling that goes along with that, the consciousness of that thought,
Right.
which is a mystery, because you can imagine making a robot that can tell you 2 + 2, but it doesn't need to have feelings to go along with it.
Yeah. So sort of a hierarchy problem. Um, and so suppose I start the foundation, and I say I'm going to take a bunch of silicon things that I can compute. That's not conscious. And then I build on top of it something. And over time, at some point, I get to the apex of this process, the consciousness emerges. I mean, I'm just making this up, Mike.
No, some people may think it works like that, but I don't think that makes sense. Ultimately, that just by making things more complicated, if you start without consciousness, just because it's complicated, it's magical thinking to say that complexity will cause
Hmm.
consciousness to emerge. That's almost medieval, and I wish people didn't talk like that. Or at least to admit, if you think that's what happens, admit that is a new postulate in our physical theory, to
Yeah.
say when something reaches a certain level of complexity, it suddenly blossoms into experience.
Hmm.
That's not implicit in physics. So if you think that's what happens, that's a new postulate that you got to add to physics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So it's not complexity that makes consciousness. It's potentially the other direction. It's simplicity. That
In a sense, yeah, that's
Yeah,
it's funny you should say it that way, because the philosopher Leibniz, the co-discoverer of the calculus,
yeah,
differential and integral calculus, pretty smart guy. He said you've got to seek perception in the simple substance.
hmm,
And he was talking about this binding problem. He was pointing out that the physics of his day did not have that thing that he needed. William James, the American psychologist, also made similar points about this binding problem. Before quantum mechanics was invented, they were sort of asking for it in order to account for consciousness.
So what's the binding problem?
That was the problem of how do we account for the fact that each of our experiences is a unified whole. It's got multiple features and parts, but somehow they're all combined into one irreducible experience from one point of view.
Right.
And
Right.
so
So
how can you get matter to do that? It's especially if it's classical matter, it's just little bits pushing on their neighbors. There are no big things in classical physics. And that's why I say the binding problem is insoluble in classical physics.
yeah, I don't think about this, Mike, because I was just thinking the binding problem, could that be sort of a gate? Now, suppose I take the binding problem and I say, if you pass this threshold, you have consciousness. So I'm going back to this 4 billion years, 4.5 billion years from the first bacterium to what we have now. And I keep thinking, is there at some point in this progression, consciousness evolved, consciousness emerged, I should say. Do we know anything about that?
That is one way of thinking about it, but the orchestrated objective reduction theory that I guess I find myself defending does not say that well, in one way it did not evolve because there were already wave function collapses happening after the Big Bang. But what evolved is the orchestration to make bigger and bigger conscious things instead of just confused little electrons or whatever. to orchestrate them into microtubules and cells and groups of cells that can do intelligent things. That's what evolved. But the conscious stuff was already there at the bottom level in the wave function collapses and the path integral that is optimizing the action in everything all the time, everywhere.
So consciousness, you would say, is fundamental.
Yeah.
It's physics.
It's an aspect of physics. Yeah.
It's an aspect of physics.
Sometimes,
and so,
when you say consciousness is fundamental, sometimes people mean by that there is nothing but consciousness and all this physical stuff is just somehow consciousness also. I'm not going all the way there. And so I would use a word like dual aspect monism as a philosophical term, or just the old word panpsychism that Christoph Koch brought up when you talked to him. That it's fundamental, but that's not denying the existence of the physical world. It's just saying physical things have this extra property.
Yeah, I'm quite attracted to this, Mike. Sort of a pure thinking, which is, consciousness is as fundamental as physics. We haven't found all the physics ideas yet, and we haven't found anything about consciousness yet, but it is a property of the system. And if you believe that, then consciousness will always appear, just like gravity. So I just want to go back to your first thing, quantum gravity. So we haven't quite understood gravity yet, and a lot of people have a lot of theories around this. So would you say consciousness is like gravity? I mean, it's just a fundamental property of the system?
Yes, I think we have to take that step. And that can seem radical or it can seem like cheating to some people. But I would just point out that we've done it before. We added like when we added electric charge. And we've done more new ones since then. This is different because it is not something that directly pushes other things around. So it is different, but we have added fundamental new properties to physics regularly. And so it's not cheating. It's how we account for what we observe.
Right,
And
right.
so the problem, so that might seem trivial. Like we just say, okay, consciousness is a fundamental property of matter. We're panpsychists now, problem solved. But no, if you're in a classical theory, panpsychism immediately has an insoluble binding problem. The philosophers in that context call it the combination problem. How do you know which combinations of things are going to be conscious in your panpsychist theory? And there's no basis for saying any answer to that in a classical theory. But in quantum physics, you can say the conscious things have to have this unity.
So do we need a mathematician? So Newton, Einstein, and Maxwell put some interesting mathematics underneath that fundamental properties. So are we missing a mathematician to make consciousness as part of the whole thing?
No, we got Penrose.
Okay.
You can't ask for a better mathematician than Penrose, and he is, and or physicist,
Yeah.
and he is. So we haven't touched on his Gödel argument.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about that. Yeah, I want to understand that. Yeah.
So Gödel was a mathematician in the 20th century who proved some theorems that I think I can summarize briefly as he showed that this is addressing the idea that I'll spit out what Gödel said first and then what Penrose said afterwards.
Yeah.
Gödel proved that for any formal system, and I'll have to say what that means, but for any formal system of a sufficient complexity, it can't be both consistent and complete.
Wow,
And
okay.
so formal system are things like algebra or geometry, systems of axioms where you can derive theorems. And they're closely related. You can map them onto algorithms. And so you can think of, and so Penrose and another philosopher, Lucas, before him, made an argument based on Gödel's proofs that for any algorithm or formal system that you hypothesize might be our mind, if you're thinking our mind is an algorithm, for any algorithm that you hypothesize might be ours, you can write down a proposition that is unprovable in that system or by that algorithm, but that we can directly see is true.
Yeah.
And so Penrose interprets that as showing that whatever we are, we're more than just an algorithm. Clearly, we do computations. Like I said, I can tell you what 2 + 2 is, but he makes a case from that our understanding is more than just following an algorithm. And the philosopher John Searle also made a relatively famous argument called the Chinese room.
Yeah.
That gets to a similar conclusion. Both of these arguments have been torn down by computer scientists and philosophers, but they say silly things like, it's the room that understands Chinese. If you remember the Chinese room argument.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
So to me, those arguments are fairly compelling that our understanding, and this is something we don't talk about too much as neuroscientists, because we're barely got a handle on how we can, say there's a dog out there or how we move our hand and stuff. But we do amazing things where we can see that something absolutely has to be true, not just my best guess based on statistics, but I know absolutely that the 3 angles of a triangle add up to 180 in flat space. The fact that we can access truth like that is not so easy to explain in terms of, classical neural networks or large language models. And so Penrose going all the way to the bottom level of reality to explain that seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, so let me ask you this, Mike, because a little bit on a tangent. So I think artificial intelligence, I would argue, is a wrong path.
Path for what?
Wrong path to AGI, I should say.
Okay.
So piling silicon on top of other silicon is never going to get us to brain, get us to the brain. There is a fundamental problem there, right? Computer science don't understand. So let me ask you, I mean, you are the intersection of this. So perhaps we need some sort of a new discipline that, well, I don't know if this is possible, but silicon is not a good computing substrate. The brains don't learn like that. They don't do anything like that. So all we have done is to sort of borrow concepts or terms from one field to the other, and it seems like it has led both fields astray. I know.
Has led both fields astray, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So perhaps we want to disconnect these two things. Computers are not anything to do with the brain, and the brain is something different, perhaps, because we are spinning a lot of wheels. A lot of money is being spent on AGI and all that stuff. I'm clearly biased here, so I don't know what the right thing is, but perhaps we need to. Maybe there's a new emerging field that where you are, which is understand computers are just tools and statistical stochastic patterns, machines, and the brain is something different. And then we can, sort of make the computers more efficient. But that is not AGI, I don't think. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm straying outside of my expertise here to speculate about where the best way forward on artificial intelligence might be, but and sometimes people think in terms of what the material is. Are we going to have to make it out of biological materials to make it conscious, if that's what we're interested in, or just to make it intelligent, actually intelligent? And that's still just bumbling around in the dark.
Yes.
How much like a brain does it have to be before, how jelly like does it have to be before it's actually going to do it? And so I think the more principled way forward is to seek the reason that the biological material is more appropriate. And I think that has to do with the quantum states that are possible on the biological materials that we haven't figured out how to do on our artificial things. But I should tell you, there's this guy in Japan. He's Indian. His name is Anirban Bandyopadhyay. He may be the guy who is revolutionizing this field, and he's trying to build a brain out of materials that oscillate, and including resonance frequencies over 15 orders of magnitude. And he's got a really different way of talking about this stuff than I do, but he's got experiments that seem to show what I said has to be true, namely microtubule resonances crossing across multiple neurons and controlling membrane voltage. So he's got experiments that may be the way forward, that are way beyond my capabilities, and even trying to build, who knows, I'm not ready to speculate if his thing is going to be conscious, but he's trying to build an intelligent machine from a very different way of thinking about computing than the usual, in terms of he talks about time crystals and hierarchies of self-similar oscillations or resonances.
Yeah, I should look at it.
Yeah, it's not always easy to follow what he's talking about, but he seems to be running ahead of the rest of us.
So, Mike, I always felt that the God has, if she exists, has a sense of humor, which is basically leading you down blind alleys,
Oh,
as if as if you're finding something interesting, and then she's going to drop you like like a block of lead. This has happened for 4.5 billion years, and
she
it's
does
going to
that to us
continue
a
to
lot.
happen.
Yes, she does that to us a lot. Einstein said something like, "The Lord is subtle, but she's not malicious." And we don't want to misinterpret him. He said he believed in Spinoza's God, and I think that may be the kind of God that I believe in as well.
Yes.
But yeah, there may be a sense of humor. Yeah, you can never tell when it's going to be a practical joke or a real discovery.
Yes. Excellent. Yeah. Thanks so much for spending time with me, Mike.
My pleasure. Thanks for your
Thanks for,
interest.
sorry for all the technical problems.
They seem to follow me. I think
Thank
it's
you.
exactly what you were talking about.
Nice seeing you.
Likewise. Take care. Hey, so what's going to happen?